So here we are with chapter 16, which is all about the lymphatic system as well as immunity. And we're going to start by talking about the anatomy of the lymphatic system, and then we will move on to discussing in later videos how immunity works. So here we'll begin with how the lymphatics do their thing. So the lymphatic system is a system of lymphatic vessels. Their job is to move excess fluid that accumulates in the interstitial spaces out there in the peripheral tissues, and it returns it to the bloodstream, and moves about a gallon a day, 3.6 liters of fluid every day. When we get to the digestive system, we'll also see that it functions to bring digested fats, triglycerides, into the venous system, and it does this with these specialized lymphatic vessels called lacteals that are associated with the small intestine. And that's all we're going to say about this right now. We'll discuss that much more when we get to the digestive system next. So it's this system of tubes that returns excess fluid from the peripheral tissues back into the venous blood system. But it's also a collection of cells and biochemicals and organs that provide what we talk about as immunity, who have the specific job of recognizing foreign particles, microbes, and abnormal body cells, cells that, because they've been infected with a virus or because they've lost control over their reproductive cycle, have become cancerous, essentially. It finds these things, these cells and the biochemicals associated with the cells, find these things and destroy them. So that's the immune function here of the lymphatic system. So we'll start by talking about lymphatic pathways and how, the tubes that lymph flows through. So lymphatic flow begins in what are termed lymphatic capillaries. And if you look on page 618, figure 16.2 shows the lymphatic capillaries. They are these closed-ended tubes made just like the capillaries. They're made of a simple squamous epithelium that's called endothelium. But the way that the lymphatic capillaries are built, I'm going to try to draw a picture here. So this would be a cell at the end of a lymphatic capillary. And then here's the next cell, and the next cell, and the next cell. And if we were drawing it here on the other side, it would look a little like this. Okay, so you can see that a tube is forming. And so there where the lymphatic capillary is in close proximity to a capillary network, the construction is this overlapping kind of construction. And so when fluid pressure outside of the lymphatic capillary builds up, then it forces fluid into the capillary, the lymphatic capillary. And then when we squeeze again, once there's a bunch of fluid inside of this lymphatic capillary, then if the muscles around that lymphatic capillary squeeze again and put pressure on the lymphatic capillary, the fluid will force the valves, and that's what these are, to shut. So they'll force it this way. The fluid will lay in there and force this to flap shut. So now, rather than being kind of open, these valves will close. They move into their closed position. And so with nowhere else to go, the lymph, which is what this fluid is, that's what we call it, once it gets into a lymphatic capillary, the lymph must flow away from the closed end of the lymphatic capillary. So we've got these one-way valves, and the lymphatic capillaries are held open because there are protein fibers that are associated with the endothelial cells. Remember, with endothelium, we've got a little basement membrane and then a single layer of cells. So associated with that protein mesh basement membrane, they're held open because these fibers are attached back in here in the muscle tissue around. So the lymphatic capillary doesn't get squished closed, it's held open. But when we squeeze by moving our muscles or stroking the skin, then that will create enough pressure that the lymphatics will see flow of lymph through them. And lymph is just the tissue fluid that's entered the lymphatic capillary. So let's think about where that tissue fluid came from. This is all happening in a capillary network, and we talked in the last chapter about the forces that move blood plasma out of the capillaries and into the peripheral tissues. And if you recall, we discussed that the capillary network pushes out more blood than it takes back in again near the venous side of a capillary network. And so that is the source of interstitial interstitial fluid. So the big difference between interstitial fluid and plasma is that plasma inside the blood vessels has more of those large plasma proteins, whereas interstitial fluid is almost exactly the same except none of the plasma proteins. And so lymph is the same thing as interstitial fluid. It's that same fluid. It's now just been squeezed into the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic capillaries merge, just like we talked about the capillaries merging into venules. Well, lymphatic capillaries merge, forming the lymphatic vessels, and they have a very similar construction to veins. If this is now a lymphatic capillary, a lymphatic vessel, where here's lymph that's coming from the lymphatic capillaries. It gets squeezed into this section of the lymphatic vessel, and then when back pressure occurs, that will close the valves, snap the valves shut, and that way lymph only moves one way through lymphatic vessels. These larger lymphatic vessels will lead on to lymph nodes. I should have made that bold too, but it didn't. They lead on to the lymph nodes, and then after passing through a little collection of lymph nodes, then the lymph will move on to merge with more lymphatic vessels until finally they become large enough to form the major lymphatic trunks. Now, if you're looking to see what the lymphatic trunks are, this is where you can look at figure 16.4 and figure 16.6. They give you an idea of these lymphatic trunks. The lumbar trunk, which is down in the lower abdominal pelvic cavity, receives lymph from the legs, from the lower portions of the abdominal wall, and from the organs of the pelvis. The intestinal trunk receives lymph with all those dietary fats from the abdominal viscera, the intestines, essentially. Oh, and by the way, if you're hearing noises in the background, my family's watching a movie, and so I've got all the doors closed between them and me, but it's still leaking through, so sorry about that. The intercostal trunk and the bronchomediastinal trunk, these both receive lymph from the thorax. Intercostal trunk, that tells you a little bit about where it is there between the ribs. Bronchomediastinal, broncho associated with the lungs, mediastinal, that mass of connective tissue in the center of the thorax. The subclavian trunks that receive lymph from the arms, and then finally the jugular trunks that are receiving lymph from the head and the neck. So these lymphatic trunks will also join into one of two large collecting ducts. There's the thoracic duct. This is the large one. And now, let's see, that is also, it's also in the figure 16.4. It receives all the lymph that's coming from the lower limbs and from the abdomen and from the left side of the body, and it dumps all the lymph that it collects into the left subclavian vein. The right lymphatic duct receives lymph from the right side of the head and neck, the right arm, and the right thorax, but not the everything above the diaphragm. and it returns lymph to the circulation at the right subclavian vein. So two large thoracic ducts that are responsible for bringing all the fluid back into the blood supply. So let's talk about lymph itself. Again, it's the source of lymph is all of the plasma that's filtered out of the capillaries and not brought back into the capillary. That gets left there in those tissues. And so as it builds up in the peripheral tissues, fluid pressure also builds up, and it forces the lymph into the lymphatic capillaries through those one-way valves that we talked about. It's very similar in composition to blood plasma. It's got water and nutrients, some dissolved gases. Two S's doesn't look right. So gases, dissolved gases, and hormones, of course, are in it, and wastes, anything that would be in interstitial fluid. Doesn't have those large plasma proteins, and if there's any infection in the body or any debris in the peripheral tissue fluids, then that will also be captured. The bacteria, the viruses, whatever toxins the bacteria might have made, other debris as cells are being broken down, all that stuff will find its way into the lymph. In the larger lymphatic vessels, blood flows the exact same way as we saw in the veins. The skeletal muscles squeeze on the vessels, pushes the lymph through the one-way valves, and then in the thorax and the abdomen, that same respiratory pump comes into play that draws the, makes low pressure there in the lymphatic trunks that are associated with the chambers above the diaphragm. Higher pressure occurs in the chambers in the abdominal region, and that helps to push the lymph upward to the up to the subclavian veins. So without a pump involved here, it really has to rely on both the muscular action and this respiratory pump to do its work of getting lymph returned back to the blood supply. So any interference in the drainage, any blockages along the way can lead to edema. That means swelling. When it's associated with the lymphatics, it's often termed lymphedema. So edema is this swelling because we are not able to bring the fluids back from the peripheral tissues, and that can happen because of blockages in the lymphatic pathways, or if as part of treatment for a cancer usually. The lymph nodes are removed and the vessels associated with those lymph nodes are removed, then that creates areas that are not drained properly, and so lymphedema can result. And so there are specialists who do this very kind of light touch kind of massage. It's more of almost stretching the skin to help stimulate the flow of lymph through the